Terrace, and I want to talk to you today about the 7 reasons why mass immigration can destroy a country. And today I want to talk to you about how it can destroy Canada. And there are plenty more, but I want to focus today on only 7. Canada's immigration policy should primarily focus on helping Canadians and helping Canada as a whole. It shouldn't alter our cultural character, nor our social cohesion, nor impose crushing financial burdens on taxpayers in the name of this fake humanitarianism. Both the governing Liberals and the opposition Conservatives have pushed for these irresponsible numbers of mass immigration, and they use it as a tool for vote buying, and rather than for building up Canada and for making Canada stronger. Our politicians act as if importing random people from the third world means they'll instantly shed the values that they had in their failed states and embrace Canadian values when they arrive here. They ignore that Canada's identity is formed by our history, our geography, our founding people, our culture, our political institutions, our resources and traditions, and it defines who we are. Rapid demographic change without assimilation weakens the common bond between the citizens. Illegal entries matter, but today I want to talk to you about legal immigration. In 2023, Canada's population grew by 3.2%. This is roughly the entire population of Saskatchewan, which was added in 1 year. Mark Carney said at a recent Muslim event, an Eid event, he said, "These are Muslim values. These are Canadian values," referring to community, generosity, and sacrifice, while celebrating diversity as making us unique and strong. Now, Trudeau also said that Canada is a post-national state that has no identity. Just shared values like openness, compassion, lollipops and rainbows and unicorns. Many of the average Liberals who support them, still seem to believe that their leaders are here to protect Canada's interest. And they don't let facts get in the way of their delusions. Yeah, you might be thinking, hey, thank goodness we have a Conservative Party that is here to protect Canada's interests. Well, let's take a look at that. Pierre Poilievre was recently on Joe Rogan, and let's see what he said to protect Canadian identity and protect Canadian interests.
The great thing about Canada is we've always sorted our shit out peacefully. Like the Protestants and Catholics tore each other's eyeballs out in Europe for like hundreds of years. And then we came to Canada and just got along. And that's the great thing about Canada is like you can come, Muslims and Jews, Christians, Protestants and Catholics, Hindus and Sikhs. They come to Canada and they just get along. They live on the same streets. Eventually, we all start intermarrying, and it's a great thing about Canada.
That's so Canadian. Yeah.
But the
Poilievre praised how newcomers come to Canada and they just get along. They intermarry, they keep their culture. But now throw in official multiculturalism and open borders, and newcomers, what happens is they often recreate the same problems which they fled. And so then they create these ethnic enclaves, and instead of integrating. Okay, so let's consider what Poilievre might have been thinking when he said people just get along when they come here, when they come to Canada. You know what? I'm thinking, in Toronto, there was Palestinian protesters burning Canadian flags in the streets. Maybe that's what he meant by they just get along. Maybe Pierre was talking about the Khalistanis who were attacking Hindus in Brampton. Maybe that's what he meant when he said, would they just get along? Or the rise in anti-Semitic violence, or Eritreans fighting in the streets and bringing their conflict here. You know what? That doesn't sound like getting along to me. And in fact, I think that shows very much naivete and irresponsibility towards Canadian citizens. The The Canada that Pierre is fantasizing about is long gone. And either Pierre Poilievre is completely delusional about what is happening in Canada, or he sees it clearly and he's too afraid to call it out. And you know what? That's not leadership, and that's not strength. What's astounding to me is that there are people in Canada who are voting for these politicians who are so clearly not interested in protecting Canadian identity. You know, as a candidate in the last federal election, I believe that my job as a politician would have been to protect the interests of Canadian citizens and not foreign citizens. I mean, every person, regardless of their nationality, deserves freedom, fairness, compassion, and human dignity. But it is okay to be patriotic and aim for national exceptionalism. We should want to be an example to the world so that other countries will look at us and say, yes, we want to be like Canada. They're looking at us right now and saying, wow, we don't want to be like Canada right now. There are progressives that claim that we're going to lose a rich part of our culture if we stop mass immigration. I would say that yes, we will stop importing other people's culture if we stop mass immigration, but then we can start to focus on our own Canadian culture and our own Canadian identity. I've even been told stuff as ridiculous that, you know what, we won't have as many ethnic restaurants if we stop mass immigration. Even if it's true, which I know it's not, native-born Canadians can't run restaurants? This is absurd economic and cultural defeatism. You know, there are lots of great examples, if you want to find them, of some cultural enrichment in Europe, in places like Germany, France, and England. In fact, in the UK, there are places in London where there are no-go zones because Sharia law overrides, informally, UK law. And so these parallel societies have now formed in these ghettos that are filled with imported conflicts, eroded trust, and a lot of scared people who are unwilling to go there anymore. Canada's heading the same way with this virtue signaling and suicidal empathy, this mindless chant of diversity is our strength, diversity is our strength. You know, this slogan that, you know, treats any kind of criticism to mass immigration as heresy. You know, it's ironic, though, that these same people, when they're talking about diversity and chanting diversity, they have no capacity to hear diversity of opinion on something like mass immigration. I would say that cultural and national strength lies in unity and not in diversity. Immigration can be good for native-born Canadians, provided there is strong vetting of new immigrants, that they have a low enough number that they can voluntarily and happily assimilate into our culture, and that the type of immigration that weakens Canada is, you know, mass numbers of, you know, third world immigrants, low skilled, who are culturally distant, and they strain our systems, they suppress our wages, they fracture cohesion, and they shift our identity. Let's look at reason number one, why mass immigration can destabilize Canada. Reason one, overwhelming economic burden and welfare strain. Mass immigration, especially low-skilled or family unification, creates a net drain on our society. You know, I'm all for family reunification, providing it's in the country from where they came from, where the people came from. I think it's unfair. There is no advantage to Canadian citizens to unify families that separated themselves intentionally. If you leave your country because of a bad political situation, why should Canadian citizens be responsible for paying this? Shouldn't the responsibility fall on the shoulders of the political leaders from which these people are leaving? Immigrants, another thing is that immigrants are often lower wage earners. So they pay less taxes. So they consume similar programs. So this burdens taxpayers, healthcare, and social programs. With 1.3 million newcomers in 2023 alone, our systems and social safety nets begin to fail. Another argument is that our population is aging, so we must bring in new immigrants to replace our aging native Canadian population. This is not solved by mass immigration because most of the immigrants are only slightly younger than the average Canadian. So this doesn't actually solve that problem. And so then proponents say that we have our birth rate is so low that we have to bring in lots of new immigrants to replace the children that we're not having. But we're not having children because our housing costs are too high. So then what they do is they bring in more people, and it drives up our housing prices even more. So we have this vicious cycle where there's a loss of hope, but we keep bringing in mass immigration because we're not having our own children here in Canada. It's a vicious cycle. We must stop it by stopping mass immigration. Reason 2. Mass immigration suppresses wages and disrupts the labor market. Cheap immigration floods certain sectors. If you don't believe me, just go to any fast food place in Southern Ontario and you'll see what's going on. This surge of low-cost workers suppresses wages and displaces young people trying to get into the labor market. And employers prefer it because they don't have to pay for training Canadian workers. They don't have to pay for expensive automation. But what ends up happening is that our per capita GDP suffers and productivity also suffers. So what's happening is that the economic pie is growing, but slower than our population. So the pie is growing, but each Canadian gets a smaller piece of the pie. So we are getting poorer overall because of mass immigration. And what happens? We still have a labor problem because, despite the high inflows, the immigrants are also consumers. So they're creating demand elsewhere. So it's not filling gaps, but it's distorting the market against its own citizens. Reason number 3. Housing and infrastructure overload. Mass immigration is the primary driver for Canada's housing crisis. Demand surges far outpace our ability to supply new housing to the newcomers. Now, younger couples who are Canadians, they can't afford homes or families, further collapsing birth rates, which politicians then use to demand more immigrants. Now, back in the olden days, we had one breadwinner who was able to support a family, a home, and had lots of children. We can't return to that anymore because people don't have hope anymore. They don't have hope that they can afford a home, or they don't have hope that their children will be able to afford a home. But I would argue that children are our hope for the future. Big families are also our hope for the future. Canada needs more people made in Canada. Schools, hospital, roads, all these utilities are stressed by large numbers of newcomers. Now, in high inflow areas, overcrowding and affordability, it pushes out the natives and it further creates ghettos and the worsening of the inequalities. Reason 4. Erosion of social trust and cohesion. Rapid diversity from dissimilar cultures, it reduces generalized trust, which is the glue that keeps people together, keeps people working towards voluntary cooperation, charity, and support for common projects. People hunker down, when neighbors feel like the others. Ethnic ghettos form, integration stalls, foreign conflicts, the religious or ethnic, They import their tensions and lowering security and the cultural bonds that we used to see when we were growing up, when people who were born in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Multiculturalism encourages retaining old country norms and rather than adopting Canadian ones. Newcomers think that they're still in the society they left, not building a Canadian common project. Reason 5, increased crime, security risks, and parallel societies forming because of mass immigration. One of the reasons someone might leave their country of origin is if they're wanted on a violent crime. So they are running away from authority. Now, without very strong vetting, those people will come here. Will they shed their ways of violent crime in their previous country? Likely not. And in fact, what we see is when we have high immigration, especially from countries where there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of violence, we see that violence coming here. So, for example, if we suddenly see a lot of newcomers wanting to come from Venezuela, but simultaneously the prisons in Venezuela are emptying, we might be, tempted to think, and rightly so, that maybe Venezuela, as a retaliation for, an intrusion into their country, might be to send all their criminals to Canada or the US, whatever it would be. But either way, it's going to destabilize North America. So what else can we look at? We can look at no-go patterns in different places in Europe where police tread lightly because of Sharia law norms that are developing. This ought to be a warning to us here. Now, if criminals know that they won't be deported, they will become bolder, they will become more militant, and it will further separate newcomers from, native Canadians. And what this also will do is this will undermine the rule of law because police will be too afraid to equally administer justice. And you can't have peaceful coexistence in this way. And when the critical mass shifts, what ends up happening is, the shared streets that we used to have, that we used to play hockey on together growing up, but now they become now battlegrounds. That's why mass immigration needs to stop. Reason 6, cultural fragmentation and failed assimilation. It is not an overstatement to say that mass immigration is a primary reason for the destruction of Canada. Let's look at Alberta. Alberta wants to separate from Canada. They feel culturally disconnected from the rest of Canada that has been encouraging mass immigration. When one part of the country feels violated or feels separated from the other, then that fragmentation becomes an understandable option. Countries are cultural projects. They're not just economies or hotel rooms for globalists. Mass immigration plus multiculturalism, then what do you get? It's understandable that you get parallel societies forming with separate values, marriage patterns, schooling, and loyalties. Assimilation assumptions fail because many don't forget the origin country norms that are incompatible with Canadian values, that are liberals, these liberal values that have secular governments, that separate church and state, that are all about individual rights. Carney equating Muslim values to Canadian values, and then you have Trudeau's post-national state comments. This signals a disdain for the principles that our founding fathers had in mind when they founded Canada. When identity weakens, people lack a common bond. National cohesion phrase, our history, our traditions, our founding fathers' principles and their legacy, it matters. And this rapid replacement, it dilutes all of these things. Reason 7, political polarization and institutional erosion. So mass immigration becomes a wedge issue that our political parties use in order to divide us. We've heard the comment before, we've heard the saying before, that it's easier to control a people who are divided. Mass immigration is a super wedge issue. And, if you speak against it or you say, you might voice some concern, you're immediately labeled as racist. But what happens is trust in these institutions collapses when borders feel uncontrolled, and we're paying for it at an enormous cost. And then politics divides into these blocks, right? So we've got the Christian vote, we've got the Pakistani vote, we have the French Canadian vote. Rather than saying we have a Canadian vote, we're all working towards these same goals, we might have different ways of getting to them. Now, I don't even believe if our political parties actually have the best interests of Canada and Canadians in mind anymore, because of the way they seem to be favoring immigrants over Canadian citizens. And all this virtue signaling, suicidal empathy ignores these patterns. And, these incompatible values, they don't disappear when they come into our country, and then we have this diversity as our strength logo. It becomes a shield against accountability. These 7 reasons show how mass immigration can destabilize a nation. Skilled, high-value economic immigrants who share Canadian norms and assimilate to our values can strengthen us. Random value from random countries anywhere in the world, random people who we know nothing about, will not, absolutely. Now, what is the path forward? What is the sound policy that can reverse these trends and improve the lives of Canadian citizens? Impose an immigration moratorium immediately. Pause all new applications for permanent residency until the housing crisis has been resolved, our economic issues have been also resolved, and some of the cultural impacts can be reversed. And then once that happens, we should be capping immigration at between 100 to 150,000 new immigrants per year, depending on the circumstances. We need to reform our system. We have to shift to high income, high skilled economic immigrants rather than, low value immigrants. We need to abolish the family reunification program. We need to tighten selection. We need to boost the resources to ensure that anybody coming into our country aligns with Canadian values. We must have interviews, CSIS, RCMP, background checks. We have to know if they're wanted in the country they're leaving from before they can be allowed to stay here. If not, we need to start deporting. We need to start deporting any illegals or overstayers. Anybody who is here and does not have a visa needs to be deported. They need to be found and they need to be deported. We can't allow them to deport themselves or them to use their honor to deport themselves. We have to go out and we have to find them and we have to deport them. We need fewer temporary workers and fewer international students. We have to limit to what we really need. If we need temporary workers for seasonal agricultural, okay, we can still allow that, but that too needs to be phased out at some point in time. We need to end off-campus work permits for international students. If you come here on a student visa, you are only allowed to come here to study. When your student visa is finished, you have to go home. And then if you want to apply through our regular program, that's fine. We need fewer refugees. Many of the asylum seekers, we have no way of telling whether they are truly in need, because the whole purpose of asylum is if you are at risk of being killed in the country that you're leaving, so then you seek asylum in another country. They shouldn't be getting welfare benefits anything like that when they come here, if they're leaving their country because they're afraid of being killed. We have to end birth tourism. Just because if somebody's parents are two foreign citizens, but the child is born here, they don't become Canadian citizens. They become citizens of the country that their parents are from. We need to withdraw from the UN Global Compact for Migration. The UN is a dysfunctional organization. We have to exit from the UN as much as possible, but certainly we have to exit from the UN Compact for Migration. Now, in conclusion, I want to say this isn't anti-immigrant. It's not anti-human dignity. In fact, every single human being has a right and dignity and deserves respect. But what it is pro-Canadian. Selective immigration built on strength. This is what we want. This current experiment that we're on risks the opposite. What do you think? Are politicians serving the citizens or chasing votes and virtue? Share below, subscribe, like, and stay engaged. I believe that Canada's future depends on honest debate. Thank you so much. My name is Peter Terrace, and we'll talk soon.